Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Chimoge, and this is Chimoge's Comments America. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and thank you to all those people who'll be watching this as a recording. So, hello to everyone looking in from the future as well. Please like the video and share it with other people as you come across it just now. And please also subscribe to the channel. I'm going to give more people some time to get on the stream. So I'm going to wait for 4 minutes or until I get 4 likes, whichever comes first before I start. All right. Thank you. Okay, I think 4 minutes is up, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. If anyone any of you want to know the name of that song that I was playing during the little break, by the way, I have the link to it in the live chat, and the link will also be in the description of the video after the live ends. That's actually my own song I made because I also make my own music. So please check that out as well on all streaming platforms and YouTube. But here today, as good as my music is, that's not what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about the possibility of New England seceding from the United States, right? I'm sure a lot of you could tell that based upon the title of the live stream and the thumbnail, right? So what made me think of doing this actually was an article I came across actually just a little before I started this live, right? Because I was flirting with doing another topic before, but I wasn't feeling it as much. And then I just happened to come across this article and I was like, bingo, that's what I want to talk about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that I can show you all this article. Yes, give me a second. All right, and here it is. This is an article in the Boston Globe. Yeah, I think y'all can see it. Yes. Okay. So anyway, there's this article from the Boston Globe. It's titled "The New United States of New England," right? And then the subtitle is "If America Breaks Up and If History is Any Guide, People of Our Region," and our region is New England, right? Because the person writing this is a New Englander, will seek to lead their own federation, right? So this article was published 2 days ago on August 19th, 2022. And it was written by Colin Woodward, right? Who is a famous, at least in academic circles, author of several books relating to the ethnic history and layout, of the United States of America. And he himself, as he noted in this subtitle, is from New England. He went to undergrad at Tufts University right there in Boston, and he currently lives in Maine, apparently. That's at least according to Wikipedia. So anyway, he opens up the article by detailing one of the last times New England actually tried to secede from the US. And this is a story that's not often told. And this was actually in 1803. But I'm just going to go ahead and read the opening of this article, and it'll show how similar the situation was back then to what it is now. So, New Englanders were upset with the direction the country had taken. They believed that politicians elsewhere were beguiling the masses with talk of liberty while perpetuating racism, inequality, and oligarchical rule. These politicians had gamed the electoral system and were using their power to persecute judges and curtail the political influence of the New England states, whose people still stood for the rule of law. The politicians also opposed federal investments in infrastructure and indulged the worst instincts and narrow self-interest of their white rural base. Now I'm going to stop it there. Isn't that very similar to a lot of the things you hear people saying today? That's very similar to the way a lot of white liberals describe what's going on in the country today. And of course, I think that this description is misleading, right? Because they make themselves sound like they're not doing anything wrong when, in fact, they're actually the worst offenders. Not that their opponents are good, but, just because someone else is bad doesn't mean you're not the devil. You know what I mean? So, but anyway, that's how they would describe it. Let me continue. And so, in the closing months of 1803, some of the most influential political and cultural figures in New England decided that there could be only one solution. The region must secede and create a new Northern Confederation built on the quote unquote steady habits and federalism of the Eastern states. In the words of Senator William Plummer of New Hampshire, right? So then a lot of people had decided to that the best thing to do was to secede. This scheme, which was to be put into motion in 1803, was but the first in a series of Yankee contingency plans to save the American dream by calving New England from a union believed to have lost its way. During the War of 1812, the slavery crisis of the 1840s, and the final months before the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, politicians, public intellectuals, and media commentators agitated for the creation of a new New England-led nation freed from the taint of human bondage, hereditary aristocracy, and quote-unquote crass frontier values. I mean, I added the quote-unquote. I think that's that modifier of crass is highly subjective, but nonetheless. Anyway, I don't want to just read the entire article. I'll put the article in the live chat in the description in case you guys want to read the full thing. But again, throughout the discussion, I'm going to pick up on, sorry, I'm going to read sections that I want to highlight. So anyway, what does that mean? Let me stop sharing the screen for a second. So anyway, what is the bottom line there? So the bottom line there is that New England as a region actually has a history of trying to secede from the United States, or rather, New Englanders have a history of flirting with the idea of secession, would be a better way of saying it, from the United States when they're not getting their way politically, right? So let me unpack that a bit more. So first, the reason I just say flirting with the idea of secession instead of outright seceding is because they've never seceded outright, right? We obviously know the South has seceded outright, but New England never did. And as that article describes in some detail, the main reason that these secession plots failed, even though they weren't fringe movements, they had a lot of support, but at the end of the day, they were still only supported by a minority of New Englanders, right? Because at least one of the secession plots hinged on certain candidates getting elected in certain political races in New England at the time, and these candidates lost. So what does that tell us? That tells us that even though the secessionists had a lot of support, say maybe 45% of the population, most of the population did not want to secede, okay, right? But then the other thing is that we have to break down what New Englanders define as not getting their way, right? And essentially what New Englanders define as not getting their way is not getting to dominate everything without anyone else's input, right? Because New Englanders, when we say New Englanders, the people who run New England, right, the people who are the thrust behind any political power in New England are the Puritans, right, who the article actually mentions, of course, settled in New England and, really from the outside dominated the US and didn't want anything to be different. Let me actually find that section of the article where it talks about the Puritans more specifically. Well, first, let me read this section that actually talks about what's going on today. Today, the Union again stands at a precipice, riven by political fault lines that are geographic as well as ideological. 11 months ago, a University of Virginia poll found 59% of Biden voters and 77% of Trump voters agreed that red and blue states should secede to form separate countries. So let's just stop and sit with that. That is incredible. So that means that over 60% of the country, right? Because if you were to average out 59% of Biden voters and 77% of Trump voters, right? You're well over 60% if you average those two things out. I'm not great at math off the top of my head, but I think the average of those two would be 67, right? So you're approaching 70%, right? Because the difference between them is 18. If you split it's 9. My bad, it would be 68. So again, not a big difference, but obviously that's almost 70% of the country, at least of voters, that would want the country to break up, right? So now more than any time in like the last 100 years or so, really now more than any time since the Civil War, Americans are very open to the idea of the country breaking up. And obviously, this is just one poll. Other polls have found different numbers, but consistently, every recent poll done on this issue has found that large swaths of the country want it to break up in some fashion, right? So anyway, let me continue. These numbers may be even higher now that the overturning of Roe v. Wade has widened the gulf between the states, and now the efforts to hold former President Donald Trump accountable to the nation's laws have shown that many of his supporters think he should be above them, right? So obviously, this writer is a liberal, so he's writing from the liberal perspective. So that's why he has that rather harsh, or I guess I should say unbalanced criticism of Donald Trump, because again, to make it infinitely clear, I'm not a Trump supporter. I'm not a Republican. Just because I'm not a Democrat doesn't mean I'm for their opposite side, right? There's more options than that. And in light of that, you know, I'm not a guy who's gonna sit here and pretend that Trump is not just a habitual rule breaker, law breaker, criminal, all those types of things. However, my thing is, if you look at him in context, he's not actually worse than Democratic politicians in that regard. He's just more brazen, right? The Democrats kind of break the law in secret. Trump just does it in front of everyone's face. But then also the bigger picture is, you know, given all the atrocities that the Puritans have committed against the, you know, for lack of a better term, lower tribe whites that make up Trump's base over the whole history of this nation and going on until today, and seeing as how that has enraged that population to the point where they're ready to fight a civil war, I think it would be good in that context for the, you know, Puritan-run liberals to ease up on their attack of Donald Trump, right? Because at the end of the day, he's just one guy, and you know, pissing off that whole section of the country just to get at him is not really worth it. But I digress. There was a little tangent there. But anyway, the big reason I wanted to read this specific paragraph here was just to show emphatically that, you know, we're in a very similar political position now as were the other times in history when New England was flirting with the idea of seceding from the Union. Okay. But anyway, now onto the Puritans, because as I was saying before, for anyone who just started watching now, you know, the Puritans are the ones who run New England, and basically they start to flirt with secession anytime they don't get to dominate everything, because that is just what they want to do. So here we go. Let's read this. Since the mid 17th century, New Englanders have had a sense of being part of a distinct nature. The early Puritans who colonized eastern Massachusetts in the 1630s and would bring most of the region under their effective control by that century's end believed themselves to be a chosen people tasked by a Calvinist God to create a more perfect society in the New England wilderness. They were to accomplish this task collectively through public institutions controlled at the local level: the town meeting, the meeting house, the taxpayer financed public school, which imbued Yankee culture with a greater faith in the possibility of beneficent government than was present in other American regions. Their ideology prioritized the good of the community over the freedom of the individual, which by the Revolutionary period had created one of the transatlantic world's most literate and egalitarian societies, right? So, what does that mean? He obviously, because he's politically allied with the Puritans, the author that is, he kind of sanitizes what they were doing and what they thought. But essentially, what this tells us is that the Puritans came to the US to colonize everyone, and they wanted to be the sole rulers of their country and of their society. And they wanted to place themselves even above the other white tribes that came. So that's what this says. All that stuff about bringing the region under their effective control and believing themselves to be a chosen people. This is nothing but a racial supremacist ideology. And that ideology manifested in their political actions and still does up to the present day because, again, contrary to popular belief, Puritans did not disappear. They are still around. They're just a lineage. People of that lineage are very much still around and run the United States and by extension, the entire world, right? So anyway, here's another key. I think this is really a more key paragraph to showing what I was saying about the New Englanders thinking it's their way or the highway, right? Many New Englanders made the mistake of assuming the rest of the British American colonies were like their own. They decidedly were not. Virginia and the southern parts of Maryland and Delaware were modeled on the conservative, aristocratic society of the English countryside, where manor lords controlled policy, politics, and the administration of justice and expected total deference from their underlings, including peasants in England and slaves in America. The Carolinas, Georgia, and the Caribbean colonies were despotic oligarchies, where armies of enslaved people were worked to death to maximize private profits from sugar, rice, and cotton. The Dutch settled area around New York City was commercial, tolerant, and ribald. For those of you who don't know, ribald just means like really quote unquote crass or obscene, especially in regards to sexuality. So all that means is that the Puritans, because if you even just think of the word Puritan, how it's used commonly today, people are very conservative, especially in matters of that nature. Whereas in New York, they're more open with that. And again, that's not necessarily bad. That's just a different culture. But because again, the Puritans are ethnic supremacists, or rather tribal supremacists. I don't like the term ethnicity, it's too vague, but that's another story. But anyway, because the Puritans are racial and tribal supremacists, they view any culture that's different from their own as inferior. So that's what that was about. Anyway, so New York was commercial, tolerant, and ribald, and the Appalachian backcountry was dominated by Scots-Irish, warrior peoples whose cultural experience led them to distrust government and authority of all kinds. The differences between these regions and the areas each of them later colonized remain. So bam, that shows you the crux of the thing right there. The New Englanders, he again using whitewashing language, he said that the New Englanders were wrongly assuming that the rest of the British American colonies were like their own. That's not true. They knew they weren't like them. they just wanted to dominate them without any pushback. But at certain points in history, they got more pushback than they anticipated, became harder. So then they thought, okay, let's maybe take a different tactic and secede. So that's why they flirt with that idea. And that dance has basically been happening for all of American history, right? There was one other point I wanted to make. Right, that's it. Let me stop sharing my screen. Another point I wanted to make was that, again, the Puritans of the past like to talk about themselves as being morally superior to the other white tribes in the US when they really weren't. An example of that is on the issue of slavery, and I'm sure many of you caught that in the article. They tried to say that the other white tribes were more racist than them because they were the ones who were the slaveholders, right? Because obviously the vast majority of slaves were held in the South, and after a certain point, it was illegal to hold slaves in New England, although not for all of history, right? There was a period when New Englanders could legally own slaves, right? But the bigger thing, the bigger reason why the Puritans were hypocritical for that stance and just wrong, is because they were actually the ones who sold the slaves to the Southerners primarily. And then they, without any qualms whatsoever, used the goods produced by the slave labor, rather, in their factories that they ran up north. So they were not opposed to slavery. They just didn't want to get their hands dirty by administering, or rather, I guess you could say, owning the slaves themselves. They just wanted to sell the slaves to other people and then take the resources made by slave labor. And later on, around the Civil War, when they began to try and outlaw slavery, that was not because of humanitarian concerns. They just thought that slavery was no longer economically beneficial, so they wanted to phase it out. And then the Southern slaveholders disagreed. So that's part of why that fight happened, right? Not all of it, right? The American Civil War actually wasn't about slavery at its core. It was just a tribal dispute. Slavery was just one issue they disagreed on, but that's another story. But anyway, the bottom line, right, is that the Puritans, were hypocritical when it came to the issue of slavery and racism. Another thing is this idea of having an egalitarian society, right? In the article, it noted that the Southern planters were very big on having an outwardly aristocratic society where people from like lower white tribes, so-called peasants, would openly acknowledge them to be superior, or slaves would do the same. Whereas in New England, that wasn't done. However, the difference is that in New England, it was a much more tribally homogenous society because the Puritans don't like non-Puritans to live near them, right? So the whole reason that the whites in the South bothered to outline all these various codes and caste system is because they knew that people of different groups, whether they be other white tribes or just non-whites, would be living among them. And they actually kind of welcomed this idea because they wanted to use these people's labor, and they wanted to be hands-on with their administration of that slavery and servitude. Whereas in New England, the Puritans very much have a not in my backyard approach. So if they view you as inferior, they just won't even let you move into the neighborhood or the state. Now, later on, as waves of immigration from certain white tribes increased, such as the Irish, they would eventually have to relent and let more of those people in. But again, if you go to New England even today, there is segregation by neighborhood. So again, now people just call them rich whites or Mayflower families, old money families, whatever. But those people live in different parts of town than, Irish people, Jewish people, right? Even the rich ones. And then on top of that, there are they do discriminate against non-Puritans in terms of economics and also day-to-day interactions. They're just quiet about it. Because the Puritans thing is, if we're going to discriminate against you, we're going to lie to you and make you think it's not happening. Whereas the planters who live in the South and other white tribes prefer to be open. If they don't like you, they'll tell you. So that's just the difference between overt racism and covert racism. Puritans employ covert racism. The other white tribes tend to prefer to employ overt racism. And the Puritans think they're better for making their racism covert, which is nonsense, right? Racism is racism. Um, anyway, so that's what's going on there. So that's just how the Puritans view themselves. You can see the differences between how they talk about themselves and the reality, and you can see what the underpinnings are behind their desire to secede, and how that has remained constant throughout history, such that once again today, when certain conditions have arisen again, they are again flirting with the idea of secession, right? So anyway, what are some more implications of this, right? For the modern day, right? So again, what the first thing I want to bring up is what would happen if the Puritans actually did secede, right? If they actually took New England out of the Union. I think the first thing we have to establish is that, as I alluded to before, just as in the past, um, the Puritans didn't actually want to secede. That was not their number one option. Still today, secession from the United States, and really that would be the dissolution of the United States, because quite frankly, the Puritans run the U.S. So, if they left the U.S., it wouldn't really be seceding. It's just the U.S. would cease to exist, right? That's simply it. Um, even if some of the other white tribes decided to name their independent political structures the U.S., it would be a different entity. It just wouldn't be the same thing, because at the end of the day, the U.S. was founded by Puritans to advance the Puritan agenda. They only let other people in to use them for their own purposes. Point blank. Period. Right. Um, yeah. So anyway, right. Um, so if the Puritans, um, decided to form a nation independent of other groups, other regions, to make New England its own country and dissolve the U.S., to secede from the U.S., um, which again, as I've noted, is their backup option. That's not their number one option, right? What would happen? Firstly, this doesn't mean that they would cease to dominate other tribes or cease to attempt to dominate other tribes and races, right? Because that is their MO. It's deeply ingrained in them. Um, the first way this we could see this is that they would still dominate the other tribes in their region, right? Because now, due to centuries of immigration, the Puritans are actually a minority even in New England, but they rule as a minority, and they would continue to do that. There's actually, well, I was looking for the thumbnail for this video. I found a very good map. Let me see if I can find it. First, let me put the article in the chat. Um, let me find. Here we go. What is this? So, let's share the screen. Anyway, here we can see a map of the self-reported ethnicity in New England. Um, uh, yeah. So, as it says here in the description, Americans of Irish descent form a plurality in most of Massachusetts, while Americans of English descent form a plurality in much of the central parts of Vermont and New Hampshire, as well as nearly all of Maine, right? So, obviously, Puritan would be contained within English, but not all English people would be Puritan, because again, the Puritans uh, are a subset of the English, or rather, they were one tribe that was in had lived in England before moving to the U.S. Because I don't know, I don't think the English um, are all have a mutually exclusive common origin, if that makes sense. I think there's certain tribes in England that are more closely related to people who now live in Germany and France and whatever, right? But anyway, I think it could be reasonable to assume that most of the English here would be Puritan, right? It'd be interesting to see the actual breakdown, but I think that's a reasonable assumption. But even if one were to assume that, again, the Irish form a plurality, and then you have a lot of French, you have some Italian down in this looks like Connecticut, and also Rhode Island. You even have some Portuguese in this southeastern part of Massachusetts, right? Um, so clearly, the Puritans are probably a minority in New England. If there are, my majority would be slim, right? So they don't have the tribally homogenous state, or they couldn't have the tribally homogenous state. Rather, they would desire if they were to break away in New England. Um, so in order to, dominate, they would still have to oppress these other tribes, and they would continue to do that. That would be the same. I think the only difference might be that some of these other groups, like the Irish and the French, and some other English tribes, might intensify their fight against the Puritans, just because they would no longer be distracted by general U.S. politics, because oftentimes because the Puritans have brainwashed, um, large numbers, probably the majority, really the vast majority of these people from these other white tribes, into thinking that they're on the same side, at least to a large extent, through the ideology of liberalism and leftism, which not exactly the same thing, but there's overlap, right? That's another subject. But anyway, long story short, through putting out those ideologies, um, these lower tribes think they're in some sort of community with the Puritans. And even though they're not completely fooled, right? Because if you go down at the local level, they will talk about, they won't use the language of tribe primarily, because they don't have that consciousness. Because, of course, the Puritans have also done a political masterstroke and brainwashed everyone in the US into thinking that race is a social construct and things of that nature, and that they've gotten people to kind of ignore tribe, really not go into what their ancestry is, right? So they can't see what's really going on. So I say all that to say these lower tribe whites won't use the language of tribe when describing conflict with the Puritans at the lower level. They'll more likely use language of class or elitism, but nonetheless, to some extent, they will note that there is conflict and that the Puritans are oppressing them. But because of brainwashing by the ideology of leftism and liberalism, or ideologies, I should say, they're They're not exactly the same thing, even though they're kind of subsets of the same thing. Um, I might just say left-wing politics, right? But because of brainwashing by that, and especially this ideology of race being a social construct, race not being real, um, and the conflict with you know whites from other regions in the U.S. And whites on the political right. Um, these people in the modern day don't focus as intensely on the Puritans as they should. But if they were all to be locked together in one country, I think the conflict could intensify. But nonetheless, the Puritans would still be dominant because they have the bulk of the cultural, economic, and institutional power. So it would really be an uphill battle for these other white tribes to gain power within this new independent country of New England, right? So that's one way the Puritans would continue to be oppressive. Um, I think the other way, though, and probably the even more distressing way, is that they would dominate the rest of the world through colonialism, neocolonialism, and I guess the client state model. So, what does that mean? They would basically just do what the US is already doing to the rest of the world, except instead of doing that as the United States, they would do it as New England, right? So basically, they would use, international military bases and financial institutions, as well as, propaganda organs like the news, like Hollywood. Well, I guess if they seceded from the US, they wouldn't have Hollywood anymore, but they would probably just make their own another propaganda organ in New England, entertainment propaganda organ in New England, and use that to filter out their propaganda to brainwash people. So through those means, they, even though officially all the other countries of the world would be independent, in practice they would control them because none of those countries would be able to do anything within the system without their permission, right? And I think they would just try and extend that influence over to the rest of the states that would form after on in North America after the breakup of the United States. And the reason they would switch to this model is essentially, the people they were oppressing would have a harder time identifying them as oppressors, right? That's a genius, the evil genius of neocolonialism. You think you're independent because now instead of saying you're part of another country, um, other people say you're in a country that's independent, and maybe you'll have a leader that belongs to your tribe, your race. However, that leader is in the pocket of a group in another country. And then your institutions are also controlled by that outside country. So you're not free, but you can't identify that because you think, especially as a result of brainwashing, that the person you see, right, the person within your country you see, the person of your own tribe or your own race that you see, you wrongly think that they're the ones controlling things when they're not, right? So that's the evil genius of the neocolonialism model. And that is just the model they would seek to implement. The Puritans, that is, if they broke away from the US and really dissolved the US to form their independent country of New England, right? So, really, if they did this in the grand scheme of things on the global geopolitical stage, things would change form but not function. The way things look would change, but the way things run would not change. So, this would basically just be an administrative change to help them maintain the status quo, right? So it's kind of like if someone puts on a new set of clothes, but continues to behave the exact same way. That's the analogy I would use to describe what this breakup would be about, right? Because at the end of the day, the reason they want to break up, to reiterate, is just because the other groups within the US are resisting them way more than they anticipated. They are gaining political access way more than they anticipated, right? With the election of Trump being the most prominent example, right? They'd hoped to rig the political system through sneaky means such that only they would ever gain power. But the lower tribe whites who they opposed politically found a way around that. So they've seen that scheme isn't working, so they just want to try something else. That's the bottom line, right? So there's that. And then the one other thing I wanted to add, because I'm almost done here. And again, thank you so much to everyone who's been watching this whole time, and whether you're watching now or in the future, really appreciate it. But I'm about to wrap up. But the one other thing that I want to add is that the Puritans, even though they definitely prefer for the country to stay together, right? Because even in that article from the Boston Globe that I was reading to begin, the author, again, I'm not sure if he's a Puritan. I couldn't find his exact tribal background online, but he's a New Englander, and he's, he's politically aligned with the Puritans, clearly based on what he says. So even the author was talking about how it would be a disaster if New England seceded, and it would be a disaster if the U.S. broke up, right? So the Puritans don't want to do this, but I think they might not be too disappointed if they have to, because due to their larger political plans, I don't think they're overly concerned about, whether or not they stay within the U.S. or leave, because it won't affect their broader plans. So what do I mean by that? The Puritans have been moving their global empire toward a borderless model, and that's a model where these countries essentially dissolve, either officially or kind of unofficially, right? They're loosening the institutional barriers between countries, and they're trying to centralize global power more in their hands through bodies like the United Nations, for example, and on a smaller scale, bodies like the European Union. And this is what a lot of people are talking about when you'll hear them throw out terms like one world government or the new world order. And, personally, I think, people are, well, it's not a positive development. I think people are way overly concerned with that stuff, because as similar to what I said before, this is simply them changing the means by which they dominate the world, the exact mechanisms by which they dominate the world. But they'd still be dominating the world. So it's not that different to what we have now, right? Because even now, sure, things are a little less streamlined, less centralized. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with the Puritans on planet Earth. That is a sad reality. So even if they succeed in centralizing power and creating this new world order, one world government, whatever, for those of us who want to achieve freedom, our goal is still going to be the same, which is just to create our own independent nations, right? That if the new world order comes to pass, I mean, I don't really like throwing out that term. I'm not really a fan of it. But if this, this, what other quick term is there for it? I guess if this more centralized model gets implemented, or if it doesn't get implemented, no matter what happens, we basically have to do the same thing. So, personally, if you're someone who's resisting, the Puritans and their global empire, I wouldn't get too down about, the so-called one world government. Even though it is a problem, it's not that big of a change. But nonetheless, that's what they're trying to do. And the reason I'm bringing that up is just because, due to how that model would work, I don't think they're, in the grand scheme of things, that concerned about whether or not they stay in the U.S. or leave, as long as they retain power. Right. So that's the bottom line. So anyway, that's what I got to say. I think the only other thing I'll add is that, I am of the belief that it is best for the United States to break up. It's too big. It has to break into smaller pieces. However, I don't think that New England as a whole block seceding would be a good thing, because that block is still too large to be a healthy country, in my opinion. Because I'm gonna go into in the future, my I guess philosophy for how countries should be run and how they should be organized, and including how big they should be. But essentially, I favor a city-state model. We should have a model where the vast majority, if not all countries, are really no bigger than a town or a city, right? So we just have a large city-state model. For numerous reasons, I think that's the best model. So because of that, New England's still too big. Then also, on the subject of the forceful removal of blacks from the U.S., to put it lightly, right, to put it in a way that doesn't get the stream taken down. It's definitely too big, because in order to avoid that, the U.S. would have to break up into city-states. Because if it breaks up into large regions, that's just the right size for the mass forceful removal of blacks to take place. And I'll go into that in more depth, but essentially, the long and short of it is, we're only still in the U.S. to vote for Democrats. If the U.S. breaks up into fairly large regions, there'll be no more need for us to vote for Democrats. But then we'll also be major minorities in all those regions, so we're in trouble. It's a lot deeper than that, but that's the long and short of it. So anyway, I'm not for this change, even though I'm for the U.S. breaking up. It's not like that. Of course, I don't want the Puritans to just use it as a way to dominate the world from the shadows again, just by changing up how their institutions look. And I guess the other thing to note is that the Puritans are definitely not the only ones who want to secede from the U.S. or they're definitely not the only ones, who have a large desire, rather who have many people in their ranks, I should say, who want the U.S. to break up. There are the lower white tribes and other tribes. There are many people who want that as well for their own regions. And in fact, the desire to break up is much higher outside the New England, right? So I think the fact that New England is the region that kind of least desires to secede, and yet still has a fairly sizable minority of people that wants to secede, just shows you how close the U.S. is to breaking up. So, those of us who live in the U.S. and those of us in general who, want to see the right thing done, who want to see, things to happen peacefully, we have to keep tabs on this and then work our very hardest to make sure that if this thing happens, it happens in the most institutionally intelligent way, in the most peaceful way, right? So yeah. But anyway, I hope you all found this interesting. I hope you all found this informative. And thank you so much for joining me. Again, please like the video. Please share it with other people you know. Please subscribe to the channel for more. I do these lives here every week. The goal is to do them at 4 p.m. Eastern time. Obviously, I started a bit later today, but the goal is 4 p.m. Eastern time every Sunday. So please tune in here again. And then also tune into my other channel, Chimoge's Comments, where I talk about an even more broad array of stuff. And I do also go live on that channel every Saturday at 4 p.m. I did a live stream yesterday about global hunger on that channel. So please tune in there as well. And please also donate to support this channel. You can see the link to donate, scrolling in the bottom of the screen there. It'll also be in the description. So please do that. That helps a lot. Helps me to keep doing this. So again, thank you very much. And I think I'll let you all go, call it night. But have a nice night and see you next week. Thank you.